Hello again, everybody. It's Stuart Crawford here with another podcast looking at various aspects of defence and security around the world. I'm delighted to be joined today by Phillip Ingram, also an ex-military individual and a journalist, commentator and pundit, and a security and intelligence expert. Phillip, welcome to the podcast. Great to see you. And maybe you could give us a couple of sentences on your background and what you're up to these days.
Yeah, so as a pundit, do I now have to take up crisp adverts? Is the next question. No, Phillip Ingram, I was 26 years an army officer in the British military, most of my career as an intelligence officer, and I left as a full colonel. During my time, I spent a lot of it as a planner, as a NATO planner, so planning NATO's joint defensive posture against potential threats from Russia and elsewhere along its northern flank, its eastern flank, and its southern flank. So whenever One Guard's tank army attacked into Ukraine, I was very familiar with their tactics and their capabilities. And that launched me into, as you mentioned, the punditry, where I'm a global commentator on defense and security issues. Most of my journalism is around wider security, counterterrorism, cyber, and other things across the globe. So you'll see me on telly, you'll hear me on the radio, and you'll see me in print in publications, as I said, all over the world.
But I think 2023, in retrospect, was a bit of an odd year in that many people, and myself included, with regard to, first of all, Ukraine, expected that the Ukrainian counter-offensive and the Ukrainian efforts against Russia would have been more successful than perhaps they have been. And secondly, I thought we might have a quick look at Gaza and the ferocity of the Hamas attack on October the 7th, and indeed the ferocity of the Israeli response. But really, I mean, really, I'm just sort of shooting the breeze there and just wondering whether you have the same sort of perceptions of the year past.
I think those are the two major things that have happened. I think Ukraine-Russia is interesting, and we'll come on to Gaza, but the one person that's winning out of the Israel-Gaza war is Vladimir Putin, because he's not in the front page headlines now, and is not occupying a lot of political discussion in different capitals around the world, and I think he should be, because he's very much engaged still in Ukraine, and there could be links, and we can discuss that potentially later. But 2023, the second year of Russia's attack into Ukraine, its re-invasion. And what I'm seeing is a lot of the commentary that's coming out is suggesting the Ukrainian counteroffensive has stalled or failed because the front line hasn't moved hugely. And I think that's the wrong way of analysing it, because that's a very one-dimensional look at where the war is going. And I'm probably guilty of hoping that the front line would have moved much more, like you in early days, looking at what happened in Kharkiv and Kherson the year beforehand, where the Ukrainians took massive chunks of territory back. But that was without asking the question on what is different. And the thing that is different is that we have the Suvorikhan defensive lines that were built, and those defensive lines of anti-tank ditches, mines, tank traps covered by direct fire and indirect fire are more comprehensive than anything we've ever seen in any conflict ever before. And I'll include the Second World War in that. And we have to recognize that the Ukrainians have not been given the wherewithal, and we're probably not ready to receive the wherewithal from the West to properly attack in. So what the Ukrainians have done is they've very successfully fixed the Russians. They are attriting them quite severely in a number of different areas, and they fixed them over a 600-kilometer plus long front line, which means the Russians haven't got the ability to properly concentrate their reserve forces anywhere and to get into a position where they could punch through with mass. And that's really quite clever. The Ukrainians, if we were to approach the sort of battle into the defensive positions, the closest we came to was during the Gulf War, and we had over a month of aerial bombing across Saddam Hussein's defenses before we then put any ground troops in. The Ukrainians haven't got the wherewithal to do that. They haven't got the ability to generate local air superiority, never mind the airframes, to be able to drop the amount of ordnance that would be needed to try and damage the defensive lines in a way to then allow them to punch through if they could generate the armored force that's there.
Basically, Philip, my perception is, and you may agree or disagree, is that in many ways, NATO countries and perhaps NATO militaries expected the Ukrainians to be able to do what no NATO country could have achieved without overwhelming air superiority. And that is, as you say, break through three pretty impressive defensive lines, at least, which the Russians have constructed. And the whole thing to me was a little bit reminiscent of the Battle of Kursk in 1943.
Yeah.
Slightly different circumstances, but again, the Russians had constructed these massive defensive lines, and the Germans just couldn't get through them.
Yeah.
So I think we were just being slightly silly and naive, or certainly I was, thinking that the Ukrainians would be able to do that. Plus, of course, the important aspect of the training aspect, which you touched upon, in that they don't have yet the training at the sufficient level of maneuver, above battalion, to be able to do a proper combined arms operations, which breaking those lines necessitate. And I know from my time in BAR in Germany, and you'll know as well, that building up to that sort of operation takes years of planning and rehearsals and dry runs and daytime rehearsals and nighttime rehearsals. And even then, with nobody firing at us, people still cocked it up. So it's hardly surprising that progress has been less than we imagined.
Yeah, and at the same time, the Ukrainians are completely re-equipping with Western equipment that changes their doctrine. You look at the main battle tank. The Russian Soviet-style main battle tanks have got a crew of 3. The Western main battle tanks have got a crew of 4. You're changing the dynamics inside the tank. If you change the dynamics inside the tank, you change the dynamics within the small formations that we're fighting through, and you change the dynamics inside the large formations. So whilst engaged in a contact battle, re-equipping, rearming, retraining, changing your tactics, changing your doctrine, and all the rest of it at the same time. I think and not having the wherewithal to properly carry out a combined arms operation, the Ukrainians have actually taken the initiative and brought some things back in that we had forgotten, and are doing it exceptionally well. Yeah. And for them not to get pushed back whilst they're doing all of that, I don't think there's any Western nation could do what Ukrainians are doing.
I think there are a huge number of lessons that Western nations like the Brits and the US and European allies will be taking from this, saying, the doctrine I was brought up, as you probably were, the doctrine of maneuver warfare, where huge armored formations swept across the North German plain and disrupted the enemy far in the rear and all that sort of stuff. And of course, the Ukrainians have been unable to do that for the reasons that we've just discussed. And so NATO and West nations may well have to sit back and say, well, hang on a minute, was this a realistic aspiration that we had in the first place? But it'll be interesting to see how it develops. How about just moving on, Philip, to looking at
before we move on, there's one point I want to say where the Ukrainians are having some massive success, and I think this will build up on it. Is in what we classically would have called the deep battle, but it's at the operational level, and we see this wall of defense at the front line, and we are trying to work out whether the success and whether that wall moves Ukrainian way or to get Ukrainian occupied territory back again. But what the Ukrainians are doing is they're hollowing it out from behind. They're hollowing the foundations out by attacking the Russian logistics centers, the command and control centers. They have virtually disabled the Black Sea Fleet.
I was going to make that point.
They don't have a navy, and they've made it impossible for the Russians to operate with impunity from within the lands that they captured. They've done that throughout 2023 and will exploit that, I think, through the winter of 2024. And that is significant. And they've started to set the conditions to potentially take the fight into Russia itself in the run-up to the Russian presidential elections and all the rest of it. Again, that is significant. And we can't, it's very difficult to measure the effectiveness of this deep battle, but the brought-in tactics that we only saw before with the Special Operations Executive during the Second World War. We see Russian factories suddenly bursting into flames. We see aircraft in different airfields across Russia bursting into flames. And we see railway convoys that are so vital to the Russian logistics support being derailed because of commando operations. And we have to remember that the head of the Ukrainian military intelligence, the GUR, is General Budanov. And Budanov is a relatively young general, but he's a commando by background. And we're seeing good old commando tactics and SOE tactics having massive success. And this is something that I think will influence where things are going to go in 2024.
Yeah. I mean, small bands of determined men and all that sort of stuff that Churchill used to talk about. Interestingly, I was speculating with someone the other day about the potential, which you've just alluded to, of the Ukrainian, the big left hook through Russia and down behind. I don't think they're ready for that yet. I don't think they've got the kit.
They're not.
They've got the kit for it. Very interesting. Thanks for your thoughts there, Philip. Very briefly, just looking at Gaza. And
yes.
Well, it's not a conflict, it's a war there, isn't it, really? Following on from the Hamas attacks of the 7th of October. And my perception is that the Israelis, for whatever reason, were complacent and semi-asleep, not being able to notice this happening. That Hamas was surprised at their own success, actually. And that success in itself has brought upon the wrath of the Israeli government and the IDF in a way that Hamas would probably not have calculated for. And that we see basically that Gaza, if not quite being bombed back into the Stone Age, as the Americans once infamously said, is certainly being rubblized for most of it, to the detriment of the population. And I have nothing but sympathy for the civilian population. But I don't think it's over yet. And I don't think that the Israelis will rest until every Hamas operative that they can identify is eliminated one way or the other. And it could take months, it could take years.
I agree with you completely. What I find interesting was the ferocity and the length of planning that there been for the Hamas attack into Israel. Israel got into groupthink from their military intelligence or their wider intelligence perspective when it came to the Gaza-Israeli border and the threats coming out of Gaza. They were focused too much on the northern border with Hezbollah. They were focused on issues that were going on inside the West Bank, and they took their eyes off what was going on inside Gaza. And it's quite clear that Hamas could see how the Israelis were gathering their intelligence and were feeding the Israelis what they wanted to hear. And that meant that the Israelis got into a group think of intelligence that, yes, we hear that they're planning something, this is going to happen, but it doesn't fit with everything else that we're hearing and doesn't fit with what we want to hear. And that in itself is an intelligence failure.
That's the classic cognitive dissonance. Don't give me that information because that's not the way we think it's going to go.
No. If what isn't clear out of this is what Hamas wanted to achieve, and if Hamas just wanted to poke the Israeli bear to get an excessive response, they didn't need to spend over a year planning it. They didn't need to come in from the air, from the sea, and cause the level of atrocities that they wanted to. So there's clearly something else in there that we're not aware of. And my suspicion, and it's only a suspicion at the moment, pending more information coming in, is it's the wider Iranian link that we keep hearing about, and that potential link between Hamas, Hezbollah, Iranian-backed groups operating in Syria and Iraq, and of course, the Yemenis, and there's a wider piece that could be put in there. And if I wanted to take my thinking in that and put it into the Machiavellian sort of level, I then start to question as to why Iran is getting an increased amount of Chinese weaponry and North Korean weaponry, and link it into the North Korean weaponry that's coming into Russia, and the winner out of this is Vladimir Putin. So it's that's something that we can look at as we look forward into what's happening in 2024.
Okay.